My name is Ryan Korstange. I am the treasurer for the Society for Values in Higher Education, and I'm a member of this research team that you're going to meet throughout the rest of this presentation. And so it's my privilege to welcome you to this session. We thank you for joining us today. What we're going to talk about is sort of the results of, or some of the results of a research project that you'll hear more about that's funded in part by the SVHE. So we're going to just kind of start the presentation and you'll meet members of the team as we go. And so I will turn it over to Kate, who will get us going. Hang on. Whoops.
So welcome everyone. We are so glad to be here, and this is sort of where our project started last year. We got to finally be in person and to really get to interact with you all around some of the ideas that we were excited to engage with. So it's wonderful to be back in this space, although it's very different than all of us had expected. So I just want to give you a quick overview of our plan for the day so you know what to expect. So we'll ask that you mute yourselves during the session. There will be times where we're going to ask you to participate and unmute. Just some basic logistics about Zoom. If you'd like to follow along on our slides, they are available to you, and there's a tiny URL there where you can navigate to them. If you like them, you can use that now or later, whatever you prefer. And you're welcome to use the chat box throughout our session. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, that's on the bottom of your screen, sort of in the middle there, and you can chat. If you want to ask questions during the session, you're welcome to. We'll pause at times. And if we have some time to answer those questions, we will. And do know that we'll have a lot of time for questions, or we hope a lot of time. We'll see. We're trying to reserve time for questions at the end of the session. And of course, we are very interested in your response to the ideas we're going to lay out today. So I think all of us would invite further conversation after the session. So we'll do some quick introductions, give you a little bit of an overview of what the project is and what we've been up to, and then lay out very briefly our theory of public higher education and why we think it's important to start with theory. And then the meat of our project today is laying out the axioms, some principles, and touching on the idea of how values are central to what our project has identified. And then we'll just close with some next steps and, as I noted, questions. So thanks again for joining us. You will see one other link here in the outline, and that will be for breakout sessions. So when we're talking about the axioms, we'll go into some breakout sessions briefly. If you haven't been in a breakout session before, there's really nothing for you to do. We will divide you into breakout sessions so you can actually have an opportunity to talk with a few people. And what will happen is you'll get a little invitation on your screen to join a breakout room, and you just go ahead and click it and you join it. And then we'll let you know when when about 10 minutes have passed, and we'll invite you to come back to the main room, and you'll have a link pop up on your session on your screen that says, please go back to the main room. But if you choose not to click it, you'll just come back anyway at some point. So there's no way to mess up a breakout room, and we'll give you some more details about that when we get there. So that's our session.
Just one other addition. We are going to be monitoring the chat in Zoom. I know there's also a chat option through the Whova app, so we're not monitoring that one. So please feel free to raise questions, but do it in the Zoom chat. Okay, we wanted to start, I guess, this next phase, if you want, with some introductions. We're a 6-member research team. One of our team members is ill today and not able to be with us. It's Tom Nelson Laird, who's a faculty member in the College of Education at IU Bloomington. Like I said before, my name's Ryan Korstange. I'm an assistant professor at Middle Tennessee State. What I want to share at this point is my connection to the project. This project really started in some ways when Eric Bain-Selbo and I were driving to a conference on the north side of Chicago and imagining what might happen if he won the lottery and what kind of institution what kind of institution of higher ed we would start and what would be included and what would be excluded. And so we kind of took out the laptop in the car and wrote some kind of stuff. And here we are a year and a half later with some different ideas about what higher education might be. So I'll let the other project participants introduce themselves too. Maybe Oscar can go next. Sorry.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. So I'm Oscar Fernandez. I'm a faculty member in mathematics at Wellesley College. I came to the project when Eric reached out to me about the opportunity, and it seemed like really a cool opportunity to connect with a group of people that I didn't know at the time, but as I hope you can tell from our picture here, we've become sort of a little family. So it's been really exciting to work on this project. There's a lot of stuff that we want to share with everyone, so hopefully we'll have enough time and get feedback from you on what we've developed.
Maze, can you introduce yourself next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Mace Imad. I am a faculty member in the Department of Life and Physical Sciences at Pima Community College, and I'm also the founding coordinator of the Teaching and Learning Center. And I came to this project when Eric reached out to me. I gave a talk at the AAC&U on the value of liberal education at community colleges, and Eric reached out to me shortly after. And I've been really grateful to work with my colleagues on reimagining what public education ought to look like. And I'm glad to be here with you today.
Okay, Susan, will you introduce yourself?
I'm Susan Bloom. I'm an anthropologist. I've been studying higher ed for about 15, 18 years, and I've become quite critical of it. I've done a lot of experimenting in my own classes, but I've also been very frustrated with a lot of the conventional structures of higher ed. And I'm very overloaded with responsibility and projects and deadlines and things, but when Eric invited me to be part of this project, I said yes. I think before he even finished asking the question, I was so excited about this idea of really imagining from the ground up what higher education could be. And I didn't know any of the people on the team at all, but we've been kind of a support group for each other during the pandemic, and we've spent a lot of time thinking not only about our task, but about each other as humans. And it's been a very humanizing and really gratifying project. And I hope it never ends because it's been really quite wonderful.
Okay, and then Kate.
I'm Kate Pantelides. I'm an associate professor of English at Middle Tennessee State University, and I'm the director of general education English there as well. And I was invited to be a part of this project. Ryan and I had met each other at a number of first year experience meetings. We were part of a series of opportunities to try to rethink the first year experience. My research background is in first year writing and writing studies, and we kept being in the same meetings, and all of my emotions are always all over my face. And I kept being in these meetings, and we both were kind of frustrated because we'd have this opportunity to rethink the first year experience. And then the answer would be like, well, we're gonna buy a bot that's gonna talk to first year students. So that is a true story. And that kept happening in these meetings. And finally, I think Ryan and I were making the same faces and recognized it. And we finally got to talking about what would it really mean to rethink these experiences? What would it really mean to put learning at the forefront of what we're doing for students? So I've been so excited to work with these really smart, wonderful, generous people, and I'm excited to share what we've been doing.
Okay, let me give you an overview of our project. Our project has funding. It's a collaboration between IU Kokomo's School of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Society for Values in Higher Education, and Soundings. We've gotten a generous amount of funding from the IU Vice President for Research. And really what we're trying to do is over about a 2-year period, we're trying to re-envision public higher education as if from scratch. And I want to define what a couple of those ideas mean, because we've spent a lot of time wrestling with each of those terms. So first, let me say from scratch what we mean by that, because that's the easiest for me to unpack. So from scratch means kind of irregardless of the traditions of public higher education that we've inherited. So we're talking about potentially a different mechanics, a different structure, a different orientation. What we're really enabled to do with this project, it started as a thought experiment and it morphed from there a little bit because of COVID, which I'll talk about in a second. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at our assumptions about public higher education and make sure that they're justified and that they enable a brighter future for public higher education. We all, I think I can speak for everybody in this, we all think that public higher education is essential for the function of our society and for the American experiment or project or whatever we want to call that as. But so by starting from scratch, there's a couple of things that we're carefully not doing. We're not ever saying that won't work. We're not ever saying we've never done it that way before, or we've always done it a different way. We're not saying that would never work or it's unrealistic, right? What we are doing is we're trying to say, what should we be doing, right? If higher ed was perfect, what are the things that we think it would be doing? How would it be pulling those things together and pulling them off? How would it be structured? Who would be included? How would faculty and staff work? What would the role of students, right? So we're trying to look back and reevaluate everything and propose a new structure that's in some ways radical. And you'll see some of that as we talk today. So public, the scope is public higher education. The sector of higher education is much broader than public higher education, and it includes private, it includes religious higher education, it includes for-profit higher education, it includes vocational education and some training things. We are focused explicitly on public higher education, and one of the first tasks that we had to accomplish was to figure out what the heck that meant. What we'll talk about later today in just a second is, as we were trying to define these terms, we had to back up and think through some theory. And I don't want to steal the punchline from later in the presentation. We'll talk about that theory in just a minute. But I do want to talk about these three terms that became really important for us: public, higher, and education. If you were at the SVHE meeting in person last year, we spent some time brainstorming with you about what public higher, or what about public higher education was public, what about it was higher, and what about it was educational. And we've spent a good deal of time thinking about it since then. And so what we would say is, at this point, we would say a public institution of higher education allows its public to engage with its resources for purposes both known and unknown to promote learning and/or to solve problems. So when we think about public and the public nature of public higher education, it is something that's open to and supported by a public. We also recognize that kind of the public, in terms of like everyone in America, is probably a little bit too broad, or everyone, that's the public, but we're thinking about a more specific nature of public. So public, open to, accessible to, and important for a public. Higher, we can think about this in terms of sequence. Higher means it comes after K-12. We also think about higher in terms of an orientation. Higher as an orientational strategy is oriented towards transformation, and that's a specific type of learning. And then education, this is the thing that stood out to us, and this is the part that we want to really unpack today in this presentation. And maybe it goes towards the radical nature of what we're going to try to propose. But what would it look like if institutions of public higher education were really organized and oriented around facilitating deep and transformative learning in every part of the institution? And that's kind of where we take our jumping off point from. What the goal of higher education is and always has been learning. we think that happens and doesn't at the same time, and we'll talk through this a little bit. And by education, we don't mean schooling, right? The abstract task of working through a set of structures, passing classes, progressing through, getting a certification. When we think of education, what we mean is learning. Okay, so you can see that there's a lot of definitions. Because of the broad-ranging scope of this project, we spent a lot of time trying to find an entry point and figure out where we would and could begin. We spent some time thinking about mechanics and about structure and about stakeholders and participants, and we decided that in the end we needed to start with theory, right? We needed to think through very carefully what we were doing and why we were doing it. And for us, institutions of public higher education need to or have to or must exist for the sake of learning. And that's learning in a broad definition. We'll talk about that more later. And so what this drove us to was to articulate a specific theory about the kind of learning we think can happen and should happen in institutions of public higher education.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the grounding that we've gravitated toward in founding our theory of public higher education. And it's really a grounding based on an axiom, principle, value framework. So those terms have different meanings in different disciplines. So in this slide, I just wanted to go through what we have coalesced around in terms of how we think about these terms. So an axiom is a statement that is taken to be true to serve as a premise or starting point for further reasoning and arguments. There are various definitions for axiom. And as a mathematician, that word carries a certain weight. For us, really, it's the trail end of this sentence that we are thinking about, serving as a premise or starting point for further reasoning and arguments. So as Ryan articulated, we are trying to think about what are the foundational elements of public higher education. And furthermore, what are the elements that we as a group are going to take to be true and build the rest of our theory from. And of course, a very simple example of an axiom would be I exist. Certainly one can take issue with that axiom. A lot of philosophers have taken issue with that axiom, but that's part of the point of phrasing our work in terms of axioms. We are going to assume later on when we present the axioms that those statements, we'll take them to be true. And then we will use that as the foundation for the remainder of our theory. So the next one is principle, a proposition that serves as a guide for behavior or evaluation. This is different from an axiom. This is sort of a statement or collection of statements that we have decided we would like to abide by as we go out and try to do the work that we're doing. You might be familiar with a simple principle: the customer is always right. Again, it is possible to disagree with this principle, and this principle in certain contexts, may not lead to behavior that is acceptable. But nonetheless, we're just furnishing it as an example of what we mean by principle.
Oops, sorry.
So the last one is values, but we will actually focus this presentation on axioms and principles. So we want to skip ahead a little bit to describe how these axioms and principles might work together to help us found this theory of public higher education. The axioms and principles do at least three things that we find very helpful. The first one is to ground our thoughts and actions. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is what I believe, if you think about it at an individual level. They also help to align our internal compass with demands that are coming from the external world. And they help us stabilize our lives when there are shocks to the system. So we as a group wrote an article on Inside Higher Ed called The Elephant in the Zoom Room, where we explored a few of these ramifications if you put on this lens of axioms, principles, and values. And then the last thing to mention very quickly is that these are indeed the foundations of our theory, but we don't mean to imply that the axioms that we will present shortly are the only ones that we believe matter. or that matter to our theory. Certainly, we will invite you to think critically about the axioms, perhaps propose new axioms if you think they are important and relevant. But we just wanted to mention that these are the ones we've identified thus far, but it's certainly a work in progress.
So the first axiom that we think is pretty inarguable is that learning is unavoidable. It may not be that everybody learns everything that teachers want to teach, but students and humans in general are learning all the time. That's where we might think about something like the hidden curriculum. So it may be that the curriculum says we're reading literature, but the hidden curriculum tells you which literature, which authors, who speaks, whose voice gets listened to. And so the structures help make learning happen one way or another way, but everybody is always learning something. And as an anthropologist, I see that that's one of our species' superpowers. Humans are extraordinary learners. We look for patterns, we look for experience to direct us forward. So we need to understand that people are always learning. The question then is, for us, what do we want that to look like?
Great, and you'll see that these axioms are meant to be sequenced in a particular order that we feel themselves build on each other. So piggybacking off what Susan just mentioned, this second axiom, the primary function of formal education is to facilitate learning. I wanted to just highlight a few words in here that speak to why we think this is such a fundamental tenet. The primary function. So certainly education serves many other functions. Credentialing students and enabling them to be competitive in the workforce is one function. And then the second part of this axiom, to facilitate learning, we really thought carefully about the word facilitate. Facilitate implies a more inclusive approach to the learning process that we think is fundamental to how students learn, and especially given all the recent cognitive science and science of learning results. So this axiom is meant to start building the bridge to how we might facilitate formal education.
This third axiom follows, and it suggests that learning always happens in a context or multiple contexts. And we would suggest that this is particularly important right now during this moment where our students, there's a lot happening in their lives, and that's always true, and that's what this axiom suggests, but that is going to be particularly important for us to recognize as we are planning for our fall. Students always enter our classrooms with a long history of learning across multiple contexts, and that happens in the classroom and so much outside of the classroom. And it's not just that they have a long history of learning content and interacting with others, but they also have a long history of learning about learning. And as Susan suggested, sometimes those aren't the things we're necessarily wanting them or purposefully wanting them to learn about learning. But regardless, that is going to, we need to acknowledge what they enter our classrooms with. So when students are in a classroom, when they're in an educational setting, there isn't this sort of just information dissemination in a vacuum. There's an environment, there are participants, and all of this matters. Prior learning is part of the context. And the complementary axiom follows.
Oops. Yeah, whoa, I went too far. The complementary axiom is that context influences learning. So the place where you find yourself and the place where you're doing your learning, or where students are doing their learning, becomes a component of what it is they are learning. And I'd give you a couple of examples of this. I remember a history class that I took when I was in college, and we had this professor who stood at the front of the room and said interesting things, right? But I don't remember that at all about the class. What I learned in the class was that a guy called Denny, who sat 2 rows in front of me, had a laptop that could play a movie and played movies. And so I sat in the back of the class and watched movies with Denny, right? What I learned was shaped by the context and my choices in how to interact in that context. Another example might be yesterday when we had the webinar with Tressie and Tony. I had my oldest daughter, she's 13, she sat in on the webinar with me, right? So in part, that context shaped what I was able to learn during that session, because we had to stop a couple of times and I had to define terms to help her understand what was going on. I was attentive not just to what the speakers in the webinar were saying, but also how she was understanding things, and kind of trying to anticipate questions, right? So my attention was divided in some ways by that context, or directed differently. And so my learning in that moment changed. I was learning because learning is unavoidable, but I was learning different things in that context.
So for this axiom, we want you to consider the fact that when we learn, we are changing at the cellular level, we are changing brain structures. And in order for that to happen, we need to have two things. Number one, we need to engage the students, and number two, the student or the learner needs to feel safe. And so this axiom is talking about that this process is both cognitive and affective. And affective here deals with the feelings, but it's also embodied. And so embodied, this is that the mind and the body are not disconnected. And actually, the more we engage the learner, all of their senses, the more likelihood for the brain structure to change to allow for learning to happen. Now, I want to say a little bit about the affective component, because for a long time, at least in higher ed, and certainly in the STEM area, there is that notion that emotions are the antithesis of reason. And what we learned from the neuroscience research and from years of the work of Antonio Damasio and others is that it's actually not the case. And rather that it is really our feelings that are initially engaged, and it's engaged at the subconscious level even. And that becomes a gateway, if you will, for learning. And so in an interview, Antonio Damasio, who is a neurologist and a neuroscientist and works on emotions and their role in reasoning and processing information, he's known to have said that we are not thinking machines that feel, but rather we are feeling machines capable of thinking. And so what's happening at the subconscious level is that our brain is constantly monitoring the environment, and it's asking the question, is this safe or not safe? Should I engage or not engage? And so, for example, when a student says, I can't do math, before they even see an equation on the board, it is usually because they've had an experience that was negative or that was not rewarding with math, and it could date back to their elementary school. Now, the good thing is we know that the brain is really plastic. And so we could take these experiences and reframe them where the student sees that they are capable of learning. And so with that, what we want to do now, you've heard from us and you've heard from the axioms that we've shared with you and that we've been interrogating and working on since we've come together. What we want to do right now is hear from you. So what we want to do, we want to send you to breakout rooms where we're going to assign each breakout room a different axiom. And you will have 10 minutes to work with your friends and colleagues to start with a brief introduction and ask somebody to be a scribe or a note taker, if you will, and someone else to be a reporter. So after the 10 minutes, we all come back to the main room and for you to report out. And what we want to invite you to do is to discuss the axioms that we shared with you. And do you believe that those are axioms? And if so, provide an example. If not, then why? And are there any axioms that you could think of that we did not come up with? And you will have 10 minutes and then you will report out back to the group.
Okay, let me add the instructions right here. If you click into the Google document, Eric Eklund shared a link to the Google document in the chat. The instructions are replicated in the Google document. So I have to stop my sharing, my screen share, so that I can figure out how to put you all in into breakout groups. So I will do that, but you will not lose the instructions. They're in that Google document. Let me stop the share, and then I'll figure out the breakout rooms. So we are going to be in, let's say, we are going to be in, we have 5 axioms. We're going to be in 5 breakout rooms. So please comment on the number of axiom to the group that you're assigned to. So group 1 will think about axiom number 1. Those are also listed in the Google document, okay? All right, I'm going to send you to breakout rooms now. We'll see you in just a few minutes. And, but yeah, so we can perhaps talk about that later. Let me share my screen again. We want to hear from y'all. And I'm not quite sure that we thought through the logistics of this. So some of y'all talked about the first axiom.
We did. Our group is ready.
All right, let's hear what you have.
This is Janice Smith. And we, after some discussion, you can read our notes, by the way, in the Google Doc if you want.
Yeah, we will for sure.
After some discussion, we decided that we think it's an axiom. We think it's been proven by neuroscientists. It's at least a good place to start. So let's take it as an axiom because it is self-evidently true. I put not in there. It should not be not. Okay. An example. We have several. A baby of someone's acquaintance pointed to a spout on a can of salt and said, "Door." That is learning all by itself. Also, children can learn any number of languages all by themselves. And we all remember if we learn not to burn ourselves by touching something hot, and therefore we learn not to touch the stove or anything else hot. We don't see any need to discuss why not. So should there be axioms added to the list? We batted something around for the whole rest of the conversation. We believe learning is a communal or relational process that incorporates some aspect of emotions. It is not something you do to yourself. It's a collaborative learning. It takes place in the context of people, places, or things. We realize this may be related to axiom 4. And part of our discussion was when the child says the word door, somehow that child already heard the word door from someone else. They didn't invent the word door. We also talked about the potential of being collaborative with nature in terms of fires. We talked about a thought experiment that could be involved with putting an infant on a desert island to see what the infant could learn by him or herself. Mm-hmm. We think this aspect is so important that it must be included somewhere, and that and I stuck up for adding the word emotion somewhere in the relational aspect of learning, because I don't think learning sticks without some emotional context. That's what we said.
All right, thank you. Hey, Amy Berger, are you still on the call? You mentioned something at the end of the conversation we were having about potentially the non-social nature of education. And I wonder if you might kind of restate your observation in the context of what was just shared.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I have to be quick because I have a meeting with the president of my institution in 8 minutes.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just about to put a chat in apologizing for leaving, but I was thinking that as I'm a field-based scientist, and there are things that I learn out in the field when no one else is around that are informed by contexts that I have from my previous existence, but that it doesn't take necessarily a social environment for learning to occur. And I think that space is allowed in the axioms as they've been stated.
All right. Thank you for bringing that. Good luck with the president.
Thank you, Amy.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I hope that this is recorded and can be posted in a place where I can hear the remaining half hour that I'm going to miss.
And this is Janice again. I have to leave for an emergency cat appointment with the vet. So thanks for letting me participate. I'll listen to the recording too.
Thanks
Thank
for your
you, Janice.
participation. Okay, Axiom 2. Who talked about that one? Who wants to share? Maybe while you're deciding amongst yourself who's going to share, what I want to say is what we want is we want legitimately honest feedback about these axioms. We consider y'all a learned group, and we think that theory is so foundational for kind of whatever new future for public higher education that there is and that we want to create, that we want to make sure that we're founded in good theory. And these axioms seem to us good, but we want to also include your experience because we want to make sure these axioms are good. If we're using this to shape a new model, and as Oscar mentioned when he was presenting about the axioms, we have used these axioms individually as we've considered pivoting our classes to online or remote or however you shape what we did in the spring semester, and we found them useful. But we want these things to be I don't know, above reproach in a certain way. So this feedback, we feel like this feedback is critical. So number 2, axiom 2, primary function of formal education is to facilitate learning. I know some people talked about, I didn't think to keep the list of group names. So some people talked about axiom 2, perhaps, or not, in which case we'll move on.
I'm on group 2. Step up.
I was not in group 2. Oh, good.
They wrote notes on it.
I was not in group 2.
I was in 2.
All right, thanks, Ellen.
And I think we were completely off because I think we were talking about learning being unavoidable, and that may not have been the right axiom.
I see. Do you have anything to add about the conversation for learning being unavoidable?
Most of the time we spent talking about it is whether or not it was a global principle, an axiom that applied much more than higher education, or whether we were focusing on higher education, and therefore whether we needed some type of adjective to modify it. And there was a question, that started this of whether facilitating mattered in it.
Mm-hmm.
I was in group 2 also, and I just wanted to amplify something that Ellen said that I thought was really smart to start our conversation. One of the difficulties we had was deciding whether it just has to be learning, positive learning, or if it's all learning. And so she suggested that perhaps our work in formal education has to be about sort of changing the proportion of unfortunate learning to useful, productive learning, and what that really means, what that entails.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. Okay, group 3, the axiom 3 was learning always happens in a context or multiple contexts.
So I agreed to be our reporter. Susan took some spectacular notes in the Google Doc that now I figured out how to access. So I can actually refer back to what we said more accurately. But with axiom 3, so the idea that learning always happens in a context, we kind of began by talking about how we don't often know about the context in which we personally have learned or how our students have learned. For example, Phil assumed students said that they'd be interested in learning the topic, but really they just wanted to get a B+. So we often teach with this limited understanding of the context in which we actually are teaching. Edward pointed out how as faculty, we often assume students are like us, that of course they're going to be interesting. interested in the topic of our course because why wouldn't they? It's the most interesting topic ever, or so we believe, because we've spent years of our lives dedicated to said topic. Many of our colleagues, or even strong students, may have a limited area of interest. Traditionally, we pointed out how higher education has been structured by context, like the school, one-room schoolhouse, or going to a school. The idea of us being able to learn in different contexts is kind of being more recognized in higher education or in education in general. We talk about, I know on my campus, Kokomo, we have all these key trips that are opportunities for students to learn in a not in the classroom, but by going to field sites or going to a memorial or, you know, an actual movie theater to learn about how, you know, whatever it may be. We also asked, is it an experiential claim or an axiom, and kind of explored that question a little bit. For example, computer games as a model for computer science. I don't remember who this was because I'm bad about names, but the idea was this individual in our group had a project in computer science, and his male students understood why it would be important because, oh wait, they are playing some video games where these same concepts are being used to create the characters in that video game, but female students were perhaps not exposed to that because they weren't being exposed to those video games. We also pointed out how students have learned so much before they enter our classroom, and we recognize that, so we kind of don't always think about that as faculty, and how those personal experiences that those students are like, oh yeah, I know this stuff, may not be accurate because of things like confirmation bias, availability heuristic, other natural flaws in our thinking patterns. But so that we kind of felt that, yes, it is an axiom, there's definitely context, and that one thing that can be helpful is helping students to understand that difference between a person, because sometimes those personal experiences aren't very accurate, but usually academic learning has some chutzpah to it or some backing for why.
All right, great. Cool. Okay. Axiom 4, context influences learning.
Our notes are poor on my, it's all on me. I did a poor job as a recorder. We generally agreed this is absolutely an axiom. I don't think there was any real disagreement with that. I think we ended up sort of working backwards and talking more about the great many different contexts that influence learning. The topic of culture came up, the physical location of learning as a context. So I think we spent a lot of time sort of exploring the idea of multiple contexts. And while the word is inclusive of all possible contexts, I think there may be a tendency for folks to focus in on how they define it and what they think context means. So you know, somebody coming from a cultural viewpoint is going to focus maybe on cultural context. Somebody who's thinking about, say, for instance, as we are right now, the difference between online and face-to-face education is maybe focusing more on physical location as a context. As Amy was just talking, you know, the context of whether or not you'd been exposed to a particular element, which, by the way, over 50% of all gamers are women, which is a surprising statistic to many people because it's perceived as a male-dominated activity. But that would also mean, though, that the context of somebody who's a gamer is very different from somebody who doesn't engage in that. My wife doesn't play games at all. She doesn't understand me. And the food service in this meeting location is horrible. She told me to cook my own damn eggs this morning. So I think we ended up talking more about the different types of context, but I think that reinforces the idea that when we saw context influences learning, that we very much agreed with that as being an important axiom, something to keep in mind and something to consider. And I think we talked a little bit about how we were considering that during our foray into forced online education over the spring, and how it was brought to light for some of us of, what that context was. The context of a rigid schedule when you're in a face-to-face environment, and trying to maybe carry that on into an online environment, and how that may or may not work because the context that they're experiencing at home is very different from the context of being on campus and bodily going to class. So I apologize for the paucity of notes. It certainly is not a reflection on the quality of the discussion that we had.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. All right. And then the last axiom, learning is cognitive, affective, and embodied.
So I'm reporting for our group, and I just want to say, first of all, to Eric Eklund, in the conference survey at the end of this week, he complained there about the food service. I mean, that's what people do year in, year out, is complain.
I have already planned to compliment the betting arrangements were fantastic. Best bet I've had at an SVHE conference, and the inclusion of a dog to sleep with was nice.
There you go.
Food service sucks.
Okay, so we had learning is cognitive and affective and embodied. And I think overall, I speak for our small group that we agreed with this axiom. We weren't exactly sure about the embodied part. It seemed like with particular examples like dance and theater and a science lab and music, that these are all things that students learn in educational institutions that are very embodied. And then, so the question is whether or not, to what extent it's embodied in different disciplines. And some of that might overlap with the affective, where I think we had a fair amount of agreement that learning can be effective, particularly in really powerful circumstances. So Gay Harder brought up the example of learning about slavery in the United States, and the affective experience of learning that knowledge. And she used words like horror and guilt and powerlessness, and we can all imagine the sort of things that we experience when we learn things like that. I also thought about this fall in my ethics course, I'm going to have students read Albert Camus' The Plague, which some of you have probably read as well. And I'm going to have them read it, one, because it's about a plague, but also because it raises really interesting ideas about what we owe to one another, what our responsibilities are in terms of being part of a community. But I could talk about those things in the abstract. I think the reason why we read novels, right, is for that affective experience, right? That you become invested in the characters, you long for them, you suffer with them, and that's important that our students have that sort of experience, that's part of learning. I think with this axiom, and we didn't talk much about this, but we did a little bit. The axiom, we tend to see these things as, promoting or in favor of what they state, so that, so in other words, to state that learning is affective would tend to say that's a good thing. In some cases it is. It may be a mixed bag at times. Affect can be very fallible. Cognition can be fallible, but so can affect. Actually, Bo Shine from right here at IU Kokomo had the good example of teaching in criminal justice about capital punishment. And the way in which students have an affective response to that as an issue, and when they're given the evidence about capital punishment, about whether it's a deterrent or, you know, is it cruel and unusual punishment, or how much does it cost, you know, to have capital punishment in one state? When they're given that evidence, often it doesn't necessarily affect how they feel about capital punishment. And so this axiom also raises those really interesting questions about, in the context of an educational institution, you know, what is the balance of these things, affect versus cognition, right? And I think, you know, especially in probably in all educational institutions, but especially in higher education, there's a tendency to I would say most people think, you know, the cognitive ought to trump the affective. And I don't think that that's always true, but sometimes it might be true. So it's for me at least, it was a really interesting thing to think through.
All right, good. And so while I'm sharing my screen, I cannot also look at the Google document. So anybody from the grant team, are there additional axioms that seem like it would be worth chatting through further or interrogating a bit?
I think some people made some suggestions. There's one in the chat right now, and there are a couple on the Google Doc. We probably don't actually have time to go through them right now, but we can discuss them a little bit later. I think the question about whether these axioms are desirable statements of how things should be or simply statements of how things are is something we probably need to clarify as we're introducing them.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. We have, as we said, axioms, principles, and values. And certainly for SVHE, we should talk about values, but we won't today because we have 90 minutes and we're trying to actually do something in a kind of complete way rather than touching on a lot of things superficially. We have a number of principles which you might think of as statements guiding behavior. So these are things kind of like the old NPR series, This I Believe. These are things people could disagree with that aren't quite as given as the axioms. So you could imagine that people would say, no, 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 that's not how it is, or that's not how it should be. But these are principles that our team has agreed should be considered as we're reimagining higher ed from the ground up. So we think that the social dimensions should be, must be considered. We think, and this one probably lots of people would disagree with the proper supports, anyone can learn anything. So this is really a very egalitarian, democratic statement of principle that we are using to guide our creation of our institution. We can say that learning can be enhanced or impeded by non-cognitive factors, which kind of is what we were talking about just now, right? So people bring non-cognitive factors in. Do they help? Do they hurt? It depends. We of course want it to be enhanced. 4, we believe that deep, reflective, recursive, and transformative learning takes time and effort. So that means we have to build some of that time in, as opposed to what we often see a lot of the time where everybody's hurrying through everything really fast. We want at each student to follow a meaningful and particular path through their educational experiences, rather than what's often seen as everybody having kind of uniform curricula that's imposed from outside. So this is someplace where we might differ from the current norm. We believe that students are inherently valuable. We believe that curiosity and awe are central parts of the educational process. Many people don't operate as if they believe that. And 8 is something that we have spent a lot of time talking about, that effective learning requires time, space, and safety. And that's something that certainly has been evident during the pandemic, where we know that a lot of people have none of these things. They've been sharing internet, sharing Wi-Fi with 5 people in the household, or they have to go to a parking lot, or they don't know where their next meal will come from, or they don't have housing. So all of these things we think we need to take into account as we develop our model. And we could certainly spend probably longer on these principles if we were going to discuss them the way we discuss the axioms, but we're not doing that today.
Okay, so our next steps for us are that we're going to be writing for soundings, and you can expect kind of a more full version of this in the near future in soundings. As we think towards a model, and we have the majority of a model developed, and we don't want to talk about that tons today, but what we want to do is make sure that these axioms and the foundation and the theory undergirds some things. And what we think is these axioms shape and change the physicality of like a university or a system or public higher education, the funding structure, the division of labor. So this is teacher versus student, or faculty versus staff versus administrator. We think that at the very core of what public higher education is and has to be is this like very narrow and critical focus on learning, and learning, not schooling, and learning, not credentialing, even though schooling and credentialing may happen. So those are kind of where we think we're headed. What we have now is a few minutes, and it's 15 minutes, where we'd love to engage some more detailed questions. And some of them are in the chat. The first, what institutional structures are obstacles to student learning as you imagine it? It's a great question. Who wants to field that one?
I'll field it a little bit. One of the obstacles, I think, is the assumption of uniformity, that people are supposed to come in and go through the same sequence of courses in a curriculum, which may or may not interest them, may or may not suit them. It may or may not develop the kinds of deep questioning that we probably also think should be part of the outcome of higher education. But because of a lot of historical factors and probably the scale of a lot of public higher education, we do kind of plug people into these structures with the assumption that we will churn out some kind of uniform products at the end.
I'm going to agree with that. Back as an undergraduate, I had long debates with my advisor, who I adored and got along fine with, but you know, he wanted me to have a high grade point average, and I say, wait a minute, some of these courses I'm taking, if I concentrating on a high grade in that course, I'm going to have much less time to learn things. I won't learn anywhere near as much if I concentrate on my grade point average.
Yeah. Terry asked a question in the chat. How's the pandemic shifted the focus of the group? Oscar, you mentioned something about that in the body of the presentation. Do you mind to field that question?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we found ourselves thinking very deeply about as a result of the pandemic, especially when the shift to remote learning occurred for many of our institutions, we witnessed even ourselves scrambling to figure out what to latch onto to try to, you know, preserve academic continuity as our institutions have pushed us to do. And I think that was really an eye-opening of us. because we were able to see the sort of daily updates from Inside Higher Ed, from the Chronicle and other places, offering, 5 tips to do this and 10 tips to do that, and use Google Sites or platforms. So, I mean, we witnessed almost in real time scramble from faculty, generally speaking, to try to latch on to anything that could save the day, if you will. And that really allowed us to think a little bit more about axioms and principles as the foundation and as a mechanism, vehicle for something that could lead you through these turbulent times.
There's another question in the chat about how we're distinguishing schooling and learning. Who wants to take a stab at answering that? I know Susan's written about this a decent amount.
I mean, I don't want to dominate the conversation. That's important to me not to dominate, but I have written about that and I'm still writing about it. So schooling has to do with the kind of institutional structures that are built in that have things like accreditation attached to them. So it's the structures, it has to do with the funding and the credit hours and the grade point averages and the curriculum and the departments and all of the familiar stuff that we know kind of is set up usually with good intentions to try to foster learning, but sometimes gets in the way of learning as people are trying, as either Edward or Phil said earlier, to get the B+ and not to really learn all, it was Phil, not necessarily to learn about the Harlem Renaissance, and as we emphasize how is your degree coming? How many years is it taking you to graduate? What is the completion rate? When we're asking about all these outcomes of the institution, we tend sometimes to overlook some of what is actually gained in terms of what someone is learning, even to the extent that sometimes there's little learning. If we think about people cramming for a multiple choice test to get a good grade, so you can move on to another course or another level of education, and you forget, as students often admit freely, they forget everything they learned for the test. And so that's where I think schooling often gets in the way of what we might think of as meaningful and genuine learning.
Susan didn't say this, but she has a book that's called "And I Hate School." There's no "and." I love learning, I hate school. And she writes about it a bunch there. She applied the anthropological lens to students in college. And it is, I would say, illuminating. There's a question in the chat from Tom. Spend more time on what the group means by learning. Leaving it unspecified leaves anyone to assume what they feel about what learning means. So we spent a lot of time trying to define learning. So Kate, will you spend a minute and try to explain why we didn't or couldn't define learning? And I know that's challenging.
So we talked about this a lot, and I think I might ask Mace if she's willing to address that second part, to what degree does learning change the brain structure. So we talked about, and this is something actually that we struggled with in the Axiom 2 conversation. Is learning positive learning? Is it meaningful learning? Are we trying to designate a particular kind of learning, intentional learning? Because a lot of us, I think almost every group, talked about the kind of learning that you do when you touch a hot stove and you learn not to do that again. So of course that is learning, but we're not doing that in our classrooms, hopefully. Or yeah, I see your face, Susan. Maybe some of us are doing that, you're right. But they're probably not, they're not trying to burn a student, but maybe they are kind of trying to hurt students so that they learn something from that experience. And we are not in favor of that kind of learning experience. So we went back and forth a little bit with learning is a change in a person, or a change and potentially also a change in their brain that impacts their thoughts and behaviors going forward. but I mean, this is something that we're still struggling with, but what we are trying to get at in our model is the learning that our axioms underscore, that learning in that the institution that we are trying to model is one in which meaningful learning happens. So there's less of the bureaucracy, less of learning, well, I don't want to work with that faculty member because they're not going to work with me, but just sort of emphasizing and focusing on learning opportunities in which students have meaningful experiences that they can take forward and interact with in ways that improve their experiences. I hope that gets at it a little bit, but Mace, would you be willing to address some of this part, and particularly this idea of change because of learning?
Yeah, so at the cellular level, when we talk about learning, what's happening is we are changing brain structures. And what I mean by that is at its most basic level, when we look at what's happening at the cell, is that two neurons are making connections. That's learning. And so right now, you are listening to us talking, you're processing that information, and at the cellular level, what's happening in your brain is you're making connections or you're revisiting connections. And so it can happen, and those connections are happening constantly, but we're breaking connections constantly if what we're learning is not meaningful, it's not contextual. And so I always tell students that forgetting is also good, because we're getting rid of things that the brain says, I don't really care about, or it's not worth spending all of this energy. The type of learning we're talking about is as Kate mentioned, it's the meaningful learning. It's the type that will stick. It's the type that will help us grow and make more connections and make and really solidify things that we've learned before and build upon them and improve them. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say.
All right, we probably have time for one more question, and I'm trying to follow the chat, and yeah, there's a lot in the chat, which is great. So I'm just trying to make sure that I don't overlook a question.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Certainly.
I think when we're talking about learning, we're really trying to differentiate learning and schooling, because schooling is all encompassing of learning and then all that bureaucracy. And we're trying to pull those things apart so that we can focus on the meaningful piece. Not suggesting that schooling is meaningless, just that what we're trying to do is get down to this sort of more molecular level about what happens in learning contexts. Thanks, Ryan.
Should we maybe take the last couple of minutes, and those of us who are on the team, are there things that you want to add to just try to conclude this conversation? Who would like to take a stab at concluding the conversation? Yeah, as you can tell, we didn't plan for this part.
I would like to. So there's a lot of publications and webinars and conversations about what's going to happen after we get through this pandemic, and this need to revolutionize or radicalize, or what the new norm is going to look. And one thing that I have been struggling with is students' well-being. Is emotional, their mental well-being, and how it was a problem before even the pandemic. And so as I look ahead, and me and my colleagues, we can't help but think about the student as a whole, and how there is, if you will, a fierce urgency to really consider what is the heart of education and where the student fits in that heart of education, and how we have really a critical role in not just offering schooling, if you will, but offering opportunities for students, and I would argue everyone in higher education, to heal from the trauma that a lot of our students were already experiencing coming to higher education and the ones that we are experiencing right now. So anyone else, my colleagues, want to add anything?
Oscar.
So I want to echo what May said and also add context in a different direction. One of the things that's been really useful for me for our project has been the focus on axioms, principles, and values as a framework for understanding the work and also almost advocating for that framework at the same time. I have 2 little children, and the schooling situation in K through 12 is just so, it varies, sometimes town by town in terms of what K through 12 schools are deciding to do amid, all the uncertainties of the pandemic with education. And we see this in other contexts as well. Administrative bodies trying to make decisions where they do not communicate what their axioms, principles, and values are. So it's not clear to anyone what the central, thought structures are. And as a parent, as a student, as a teacher or an educator, it's very hard, I think, working from having to somehow figure things out, decision-making processes. So I think as a framework, we've really tried to start from a foundation where it is possible to disagree with some of the principles, some of the axioms, propose new ones, but at least we're saying here is the foundational foundation, right, of our theory. And then this is what we build from there. I'll say one last thing. I think one of the reasons why this is such a helpful way is that maybe further down the line, if you disagree with some model, some aspect of the model we developed, you can point directly to one of the axioms or principles or values and see, aha, I think this is the core source of that disagreement. And I think that's a really useful device and vehicle for expressing, productive conversations.
Yeah. All right, that's our time. And we appreciate your attention and interaction. We'll look through your comments with great interest in the Google document. And thank you so much. We appreciate it. See you all later.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.